Maya Johnson had worked at Ridgeway Enterprises for nearly 7 years. Arriving before dawn when the skyscraper still slumbered in darkness, its glass walls reflecting the city's dim streetlights. Her day began in silence, save for the faint hum of elevators and the soft swish of her mop on marble floors. She moved through the offices like a shadow, polishing conference tables, emptying trash cans, and straightening chairs that would soon seat powerful executives making decisions worth millions. To most employees, she was invisible, just another uniform, another pair of rubber gloves. But Maya noticed everything: the forgotten coffee mugs, the unopened windows that made rooms stuffy, the way people's faces betrayed moods they never spoke aloud. That Monday morning, she was cleaning the executive boardroom when she saw Charles Ridgway, the CEO himself, sitting alone at the far end of the polished mahogany table. It was unusual. He rarely arrived this early, and when he did, he came surrounded by assistants and with a coffee in hand. Today there was no coffee. His posture, normally straight and commanding, was slightly hunched, and his skin looked pale, almost gray under the fluorescent lights. As she wiped the table near him, she caught sight of his hand trembling as he signed documents, the pen scratching unevenly against the paper. A bead of sweat slid down his temple, though the air conditioning was set to its usual chill. Maya's heart gave a small jolt. She had seen this before, years ago, with her late father, who had brushed off his fatigue and shortness of breath until it became a fatal heart attack. She paused, cloth in hand, debating whether to say something. But who was she to question a man like Charles Ridgway? She was just the cleaning lady. Still, as she moved toward the door, she glanced back and saw him shift in his seat, pressing a hand briefly to his chest before quickly resuming his work as a junior executive entered the room. The visitor didn't notice a thing, just handed over folder and left. That was the first time Maya realized that in this building, surrounded by suits and titles, it was possible for someone to be visibly in distress and yet remain completely unseen. She pushed her cart into the hallway, but her mind wouldn't let it go. All day, between emptying bins and dusting desks, her thoughts circled back to that image of the CEO, sweating and pale. Most people would have chalked it up to stress or skipped meals, but Maya's instincts whispered a different warning. She told herself she'd keep an eye on him, even if it meant being more deliberate in her rounds on the executive floor. Because sometimes the people one notices are the only ones who notice what really matters. The next morning, Maya deliberately lingered on the top floor longer than her usual schedule allowed, making a slow circuit of the hall outside the CEO's office. She pretended to fuss over a stubborn smudge on a glass partition while her eyes darted toward the open doorway. Charles Ridgway sat at his desk, his suit impeccable as always, but there was something off again. He leaned forward over his computer, rubbing the bridge of his nose with one hand while the other tapped out an email at a slower pace than she'd ever seen from the famously efficient businessman. His lips were slightly parted, as if he were short of breath, and when he reached for a glass of water, his hand shook just enough to make the liquid ripple. Maya's instincts tightened like a fist in her gut. The corporate assistant, a tall, brisk woman named Claire, swept into the office moments later with a stack of reports. "Mr. Ridgway, the quarterly review's ready for your approval," she said without looking up from her clipboard. He nodded, forced a polite smile, and signed the papers, his pen dragging a fraction longer over each page. Not once did Claire glance at his face or notice the sheen of sweat gathering at his hairline. Maya had to bite her tongue. She wanted to say something, to tell them all that something wasn't right, but she knew how it would sound. She was a cleaning lady, not a doctor, and certainly not someone in the CEO's inner circle. If she overstepped, she could lose the job she desperately needed to support her daughter, Naomi, who was starting her first year of college. Still, she couldn't shake the memory of her father's collapse, the panic drive to the ER, the way the doctor had told her later that the signs had been there all along. That afternoon, while cleaning a conference room near the CEO's office, Maya overheard part of a conversation between Charles and a board member on speakerphone. "Just tired, that's all. Been skipping lunch lately," he said lightly, brushing off a comment she hadn't heard. There's a cough, low, raspy, and then silence. Maya stood frozen, her hand on the back of a chair, thinking, no, this isn't just tired. But when she looked through the glass wall, Charles was already back to typing, his jaw set, as if sheer willpower could banish whatever was happening inside his body. For the rest of her shift, Maya made a quiet promise. If she saw another sign, just one more, she'd act, no matter the risk to her job. She didn't know how or when, but she wouldn't stand by while history repeated itself. 2 days later, Maya's decision to keep watch proved more urgent than she could have imagined. It was a Thursday morning, the kind of busy day when the executive floor buzzed with activity ahead of the board's monthly meeting. Maya was polishing the chrome handles on the double doors to the boardroom when she saw Charles Ridgeway stride out of his office, a folder tucked under his arm. At first glance, he looked every bit the confident leader, tailored navy suit, shoes shining like glass, but as he walked toward the conference room, his steps slowed, his shoulders drooped, and for the briefest moment he reached out to steady himself against the wall. No one else saw it. Assistants were hurrying past with coffee trays, managers were checking their phones, and Claire was already inside arranging presentation slides. Maya's eyes locked on him, and in that instant, she saw the faint grimace that crossed his face, the way he pressed his lips together as though swallowing a wave of discomfort. She ducked into the boardroom after him, pretending to adjust chairs, but really she wanted to stay close enough to watch. As the meeting began, Charles launched into his usual opening remarks, but his voice seemed weaker, less commanding. He paused mid-sentence, his hand drifting to his chest for just a second before he carried on as though nothing had happened. No one commented. Perhaps they thought he was clearing his throat. Perhaps they didn't notice at all. Maya, however, noticed everything. She had seen this exact combination before: paleness, fatigue, sweating, subtle chest pressure, and she knew it could be a warning sign for something far worse. The meeting stretched on, and she forced herself to leave before her lingering became suspicious, but she resolved to loop back near the end. Sure enough, an hour later, she returned to find the meeting wrapping up. Charles stood, shook hands with a few board members, and then as the room began to empty, he braced himself against the table, his knuckles whitening. He stayed there for a moment longer than seemed normal, his head slightly bowed. That was it, the confirmation she needed. Maya's pulse hammered in her ears as she wheeled her cart down the hallway, debating how to approach him without causing a scene. She could wait until everyone left, she reasoned, then maybe mention it discreetly. But a darker thought crept in. What if she waited and something happened before she spoke up? That was the moment Maya realized she couldn't keep quiet any longer. Job or no job, the signs were too glaring, the risk too great. Her father had been a good man, but pride and denial had taken his life. She wasn't about to let the same thing happen to someone else just because no one wanted to notice. The next morning, Maya arrived earlier than usual, her nerves on edge. She had spent the night tossing and turning, replaying the image of Charles Ridgeway gripping the boardroom table, his face pale and strained. She knew that if she stayed silent, she'd never forgive herself, but speaking up carried its own dangers. In a corporate world where hierarchy was law, a cleaning lady interrupting the CEO about his health was more than unusual. It was almost unthinkable. Still, as she polished the brass plaque outside his office, she heard the low murmur of his voice inside, speaking on the phone. His tone was calm, but there was a rasp beneath it, a labored quality that made her chest tighten in sympathy. She hesitated, cloth in hand, then gave a light knock on the doorframe. Charles glanced up, surprised. Yes, his eyes were sharp, assessing, but she also saw the faint glaze of fatigue clouding them. Maya stepped inside slowly. "Mr. Ridgeway, I'm sorry to bother you, but I couldn't help noticing you haven't seemed well lately." For a second, he didn't react, just stared, as though trying to decide if he'd heard correctly. Then he gave a short, polite smile. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine. Just a busy week." She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "I don't mean to intrude, sir, but I've seen these signs before. The sweating, the shortness of breath, the way you've been holding your chest. It might not be just stress." His smile faltered, and he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands on the desk. "You've been paying that much attention to me?" he asked, a trace of incredulity in his tone. Maya nodded, her pulse racing. "I lost my father to a heart attack because no one took the early signs seriously, not even him. I couldn't stay quiet if I saw it happening again." There was a long pause, and she could feel the weight of the silence pressing on her. Finally, Charles exhaled, glancing away. "I had a checkup last year. Everything was fine." But his voice lacked conviction, and Maya could tell he was brushing her off. "A lot can change in a year," she said gently. "Please, just see a doctor. If I'm wrong, I'll gladly be wrong." For a moment, something unspoken flickered across his face. Uncertainty, maybe even fear, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "I'll think about it," he said at last, dismissing her with a polite nod. Maya left his office, her heart pounding, unsure if she'd crossed a dangerous line or if she'd just planted the seed that might save his life. It was the following Tuesday when Maya's worst fears materialized. The day had begun like any other. She made her usual rounds, pushing her cart through the gleaming corridors of Ridgeway Enterprises, her mind half on her work and half on her daughter Naomi's upcoming visit from college. By mid-morning, the executive floor was unusually busy. A delegation from overseas had arrived for negotiations, and everyone seemed to be moving twice as fast. Maya was dusting a side table near the boardroom when she caught sight of Charles Ridgeway walking alongside the foreign delegates, his smile firmly in place, but his complexion unervingly pale. She noticed his gait, slightly uneven, as though each step was more effort than it should be. As the group disappeared into the conference room, she felt the knot in her stomach tighten. She decided to linger nearby, under the pretense of cleaning the hallway's glass partitions. Barely 20 minutes into the meeting, the sound of muffled voices rose from inside, followed by an uneasy pause in conversation. Then, through the half-open door, Maya saw it happen. Charles swayed on his feet mid-sentence, clutching the edge of the table. A delegate reached toward him, but in the blink of an eye, he collapsed, hitting the carpeted floor with a dull thud. Chairs scraped back as people shouted for help, but no one seemed to know what to do beyond calling 911. Maya's instincts took over. She rushed inside, kneeling beside him, noting his shallow breaths and the way his skin had gone ashen. "He's having a cardiac episode. Tilt his head. Keep the airway clear," she barked, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. Years earlier, she had taken a CPR course at the community center, and now every lesson came flooding back. She loosened his tie, checked his pulse, and began chest compressions when his breathing faltered. Her arms ached, but she kept the rhythm steady until a faint gasp told her he was fighting his way back. Paramedics arrived minutes later, taking over with oxygen masks and monitors. As they lifted him onto a stretcher, Charles's eyes fluttered open for a moment, landing on Maya. There was confusion there, but also recognition. She squeezed his hand briefly before stepping back, letting the professionals do their work. The boardroom was silent now, every polished shoe and expensive suit frozen in place, staring at the woman who had just saved the life of the most powerful man in the building. Without a word, Maya picked up her cleaning cart and wheeled it into the hallway, her heart still pounding. Not from the effort, but from the terrifying confirmation that she had been right all along. The office felt different the next day, quieter, as if the walls themselves were still holding their breath. Word of the incident had spread quickly, though the details were muddled in whispers. Some said Charles had fainted. Others claimed it was just exhaustion from overwork, but Maya knew the truth. He was in the hospital now, undergoing tests, and the fact that he was still alive was something she had clung to all night. She hadn't expected to hear from anyone in his circle, so when Claire, his famously aloof assistant, called her into the executive office mid-morning, Maya braced herself for bad news, or worse, a reprimand for overstepping. Instead, she found Claire looking unusually subdued, her usual sharp tone softened. "Mr. Ridgeway asked to see you," she said simply. Maya's heart skipped. She was escorted to the hospital later that afternoon, where she found Charles sitting up in bed, dressed in a light hospital gown, the harsh fluorescent lights casting shadows over his face. He looked smaller somehow, less like the untouchable CEO, and more like a man who had been reminded of his own mortality. Maya, he greeted, his voice hoarse but steady. They told me you saved my life. She shifted uncomfortably, unsure what to say. I just did what I could, she murmured. He shook his head, his expression intense. No, you noticed what no one else did. You acted when everyone else froze. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the powerful executive and the woman who cleaned his floors, now bound by a moment that had nothing to do with job titles. The doctor said I had a blockage, he continued. If I'd ignored it much longer, I wouldn't be here. You were right. There was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, and Maya realized how rare it must be for a man like him to admit that. I kept thinking about my father, she confessed quietly. I couldn't watch the same thing happen to you. He nodded slowly, as though absorbing the weight of her words. I owe you more than I can ever repay, he said at last. The conversation drifted to lighter topics after that, but when Maya left the hospital, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Something had shifted. He wasn't just her employer anymore, and she wasn't just the invisible cleaning lady. They had crossed a line into something far more human, something neither of them could have predicted. 2 weeks later, Charles Ridgeway returned to Ridgeway Enterprises, looking healthier than Maya had ever seen him. The faint gray pallor was gone from his skin, his steps were steady, and though he still moved with the caution of someone recovering, there was a brightness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Maya tried to keep to her usual routine, but it became clear that avoiding him was impossible. Word had spread beyond the building, and employees now looked at her with a mix of admiration and curiosity. That Friday afternoon, Claire intercepted her with a mysterious smile and led her to the top floor. Mr. Ridgeway wants a moment, she said. Inside his office, Charles stood near the window, a folder in his hand. Maya, he began, I've been thinking about what happened and about how easily I could have ignored you. You gave me back my life. Now, I want to give you something in return. He opened the folder and slid a document across the desk. Maya glanced down, confused at first, then her breath caught. It was a deed to a small but beautiful house on the outskirts of the city, mortgage-free, in her name. I can't accept this, she said immediately, her hands trembling. You can and you will, he replied firmly, though his tone was warm. You've spent your life taking care of others, your daughter, your community, and you still found it in your heart to take care of me. That deserves more than words. Tears stung her eyes as she tried to speak, but he continued. There's also a position I'd like you to consider, community liaison for our new outreach program. Better pay, regular hours, and the chance to do more of what you're clearly meant to do. Look out for people. Maya was speechless, her mind spinning. A stable job with benefits, a home she could call her own. These were things she had dreamed about, but never dared to believe could happen. Slowly, she nodded, unable to stop the smile spreading across her face. Thank you, Mr. Ridgeway, she whispered. Charles, he corrected gently. From now on, you can call me Charles. As she left his office, clutching the folder to her chest, Maya felt a strange mix of joy and disbelief. She had started as the invisible woman in the background, just another face in a world that didn't notice her. But by speaking up, by daring to care, she had not only saved a life, she had changed her own forever.